I'm Michelle, for those who haven't met me yet. I'm going to reflect briefly on the sermon last time and read the Bible. I'll help you cast your mind back 2 weeks ago, pre-research week. We were looking at Genesis 29 and asking the question, does it have to be so hard to be promise bearers? Do we have to constantly fight with angst and jealousy and rivalry? We examined the relationship between Rachel and Leah and the constant warring and tensions that were there, and Rachel's scheming and manipulating to outbeat her sister in bearing children. And then coming to this point of realising that only it was God who would further the promise, and submitted herself to his plan and purpose. And we were encouraged that it doesn't have to be that way for us as promise bearers who are working out God's kingdom purposes in the world, and that we can submit to him and trust him as he does that, and not be scheming against one another is one way to think about it. So that is something that I've been reflecting on since the sermon. I struggle a lot with comparisons. I'm sure a lot of us do. Comparing myself to other people in ministry, and I think probably I have a bit of a mentality like Rachel and Leah, not tallying up babies per se, but tallying up my ministry successes to others. I might think, oh, that person's doing really well at that thing, and I get frustrated and I get a little bit bitter, but then I start to think, oh, well, I did well at this a couple of weeks ago, so that's a point for me. And I do it a lot, and it's a struggle for me in ministry previously, here at college. So I was encouraged to remember that instead of, being frustrated or bitter with other people, actually we can work together alongside one another to further God's purposes. And that's a great joy, and it brings a lot of freedom to realise that people have giftings that I don't, that people are more godly than me, and that I can strive to be like them but not compare myself to them in unhelpful ways. I was really encouraged to keep leaning upon God, accepting my weaknesses, celebrating others' successes, and finding joy in being just a small part of what God's doing in the world. So I'd invite you as a response to ask me how I'm going with that, ask each other. Might be a bit awkward if the person you're comparing yourself to says, how are you going with comparisons? It'll humble you, I'm sure. So feel free to ask me, and I'd love for us to talk about that, because I think it can, comparison is something that can breed very easily in Christian circles in quiet. So let's open it up to the light. I'm going to read from Genesis 30, verse 25 to 43, but Janson's going to be speaking right through to the end of chapter 31. Genesis 30, 25 to 43. I've got the NIV here. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so that I can go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and children, for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favour in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." He added, "Name your wages, and I will pay them." Jacob said to him, "You know how I have worked for you, and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household?" "What shall I give you?" he asked. "Don't give me anything," Jacob replied. "But if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-coloured lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages. And my honesty will testify for me in the future, whenever you check on the wages you have paid me. Any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-coloured, will be considered stolen." "Agreed," said Laban. "Let it be as you have said." That same day he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats. all that had white on them, and all the dark-coloured lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. Jacob, however, took fresh-cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees and made white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs, so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they mated in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-coloured animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the trough in front of the animals so that they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys.
When I heard you've all been talking about me and talking about me for weeks on end, I jumped at the chance to do some explaining. I have to admit I'm a bit flattered that the best-selling book of all time goes on and on about me. But as soon as I think of how unflattering I come off looking, I guess I'm not quite so flattered after all. And the thing is, it's all true. But since it's now part of God's speech to all his people, the lessons here are not just for me, they're for you. Of course, in this part of the story that you're in, I'm stuck in Haran, far from the promised land. It's been more than 14 years longer than my original plan. Man, am I struggling. Have you been there? Not Haran, but stuck. I mean, I just can't take it anymore stuck. I don't want to be in this situation. And things with Rachel hadn't been great. When she was deep in her own struggle, not able to get pregnant, my response to her, "Dear, do I look like God to you?" didn't really go over very well. But after she finally had a baby, even with our marriage problems, that's when I knew she might just be open to getting out of here with me. So I said to Laban, "Send me on my way." No, I didn't say please. But he owed me big time. If you look at your copy of my story, verse 26, I said, "Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I have done for you." Now, you can't see it in English, but I use the same Hebrew word 3 times to drive home all the hard labor I'd done for him. I came to Haran thinking I'd be treated like family. I ended up being treated like a slave. Even if I was an actual slave, masters are supposed to send their slaves away when their term is up, with plenty of wealth to live on. Laban, after 14 years of hard labor, not a single cent from him. What he did was offer to pay me if I stayed and if I did more work for him. Look how he says it in verse 27. "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. Name your wages and I'll pay for them." If I found favor in your eyes, him find favor in my eyes? Was I supposed to take this seriously? After all that's went down between us? He goes on there to say, in that same verse, to reveal why he wanted me to stay. because my presence had prospered him. He says, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Now, I'm not sure why he needed to meddle with divination just to find out that God had blessed him because of me. But that's a pagan for you, isn't it? I responded, as you can see in verse 29, you know how I have worked for you and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. Now, I know he already admitted it was because of me that he was blessed so much, but here I just couldn't resist rubbing it in a bit more. And no, I never was known for talking about God much or using his name, really. But I had figured out that there's a lot to be gained by inserting God into a conversation. Here's what you got to understand. The wealthy, prosperous man that I'd long pictured myself becoming, this just hadn't happened. So I'm feeling stuck in a never-ending rut. My dad's hope for me in coming to Haran, or you call him Isaac, it was for me to build not just a family, but material wealth to support my family. It just wasn't happening. Yes, Rachel had finally given birth. And you probably know I'd already had a dozen kids by now, but a man is expected to have a nest egg build up. Me, after so many years of slaving away, I had zippo to show for it. I was just as flat broke 14 years on as I was when I first came to this land. My frustration shows through a bit in verse 30. But now, when may I do something for my own household? So, yes, I had plans for myself. I know you've read my story. God had plans for me too. At Bethel, he revealed this most spectacular plan for my life, to bless me and to bless the whole world through me. To be honest, though, falling short of God's plan for my life wasn't really my focus. I just wanted to make something of myself. You know what I mean? To make a name for myself. I needed to break through and have my life go somewhere. Of course, for someone carrying the special blessing of God on their life, this wasn't the best attitude. I knew well the stories of Grandpa Abraham and how he felt stuck too. God took 25 years to give him a son. I thought I'd been waiting a long time to get what I wanted out of life. Anyway, did you see how Laban responded in verse 31 there? What shall I give you? He said. And that's when it hit me. He'd already said in verse 28, name your wages. So I'm thinking, really? Anything? Okay, maybe I just will. I mean, this guy's wanting me to work for what by rights he should have already given me. So when he's saying name your wages, I'm seeing a hole there big enough to drive a camel caravan through. So I replied, verse 31, don't give me a thing. Well, that was an exaggeration, but that's how we bargain in my world. We exaggerate. Then I got to the point. But if you will do this one thing for me, I'll go on tending your flocks and watching over them. So I'm thinking, well, if my idea works, maybe I'll just stay here in Haran after all. The last thing, really, that I wanted to do was to go back to Canaan and face that murderous brother of mine. My idea was that Laban would give me a small starter flock of just the rarest kinds of sheep and goats, just the multicolored ones, the streaked and the spotted and the speckled ones. So I was only asking for this small minority of animals and just their rare offspring, their multicolored offspring, to be my future wages. I'm actually a bit embarrassed by verse 33. Did you see what I said there? I said, and my honesty will testify for me in the future. I actually said it with a straight face. I knew how it sounded. I'm thinking this whole deal's blown. Laban knew my story. Me? Honest? But anyway, the idea was that he could hold me accountable just by looking at the fur color of the animals I took for my wages. If I ever started ripping him off, taking more of my fair share, then it'd be obvious. So Laban said, agreed. Let it be as you said. Of course, I should have known he wouldn't be honest with me. Did you see what he did? Laban takes my multicolored starter flock for himself, and he gives it to his sons, moves them 3 days' journey away from me. He cheated me. Again. I've never met such a selfish, manipulative schemer. Now I was stuck more than ever. To even begin my starter flock, now I had to first wait for the yet-to-be-born animals. And the chances that the multicolored ones that I could keep would be born to the solid-colored flock that I was left shepherding, it was now so much smaller. But as they say, you've got to fight fire with fire, right? So little did Laban know I had a plan up my sleeve. I took some sticks and I peeled the bark off a bunch of those sticks to reveal stripes of white, stripes of white. And then I set up what were stripy, multicolored sticks in the watering troughs where the sheep and the goats would come to drink, but also breed. And voila! They produced en masse the striped and spotted offspring I could keep. But here's the kicker. Not only did this strategy increase my fair share of the flock, I employed it only for the fittest of animals. This meant that my multicolored flocks became stronger and stronger, and Laban's became weaker and weaker. The upshot is in one of my favorite verses, verse 43. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. Now, I know some people think that my breeding scheme's a sign I had special knowledge, even magic. I've even heard of preachers holding me up as some kind of a model of hard work and industriousness. It's too bad no one thinks to say it was because of my good looks or smooth skin. But do you remember how I used a goat skin ploy with my dad to get the upper hand over my brother? Here I've just used another goat skin ploy to get the upper hand over my uncle. Now, it's true, no one else I know has ever actually made this breeding strategy work. So maybe, overall, it was just a God thing. I did wonder about that Bethel dream I'd had. God promised to be with me on this journey. Was that promise somehow connected to this breeding scheme going so well? Anyway, looking back, I now see that God didn't really enter into my decision-making process. What should I have done when I was feeling so stuck, so anxious to just break free and succeed in life? Maybe I could have waited on God, like Grandpa Abraham is known for doing. Using this scheme to get back at Laban, taking vengeance into my own hands, well, first, it wasn't the right thing to do. And second, it came with consequences. It made things go from bad to worse. When Laban's sons found out my scheme was actually breeding them into the ground, breeding them into poverty, well, they said in chapter 31, verse 1 of my story, Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father. Now, they're clearly exaggerating here. I didn't take everything, but boy, was Laban outraged when he found out what I did. And verse 2 points out how it was at that point I noticed Laban's attitude toward me had drastically changed. He went full aggro on me. Have you ever felt stuck in being with someone that was upset with you? Or stuck with someone who didn't like you? It made me anxious to the point of nausea just to think about seeing him around. But just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, God showed up. When I thought I couldn't take it any longer, when I thought the heat couldn't get any hotter, God showed up. He said, go back to the land of your fathers, in verse 3, and to your relatives, and I will be with you. God showed up before at Bethel when I first fled here from the heat of Esau's murderous rage. There, I was on the way out of the promised land. God promised there that he would be with me on this trip and one day bring me back home. Right here, he shows up again to tell me it's time. Time to go home. What sweet words those were. And really, to know God wants you to journey in a certain direction. It's an exhilarating, almost indescribable feeling. And especially that he's coming with you. And that he's not just leaving you alone, but he's coming with you on the journey to ensure your success. I will be with you. What a great, great promise. Yet, for me, it's always been hard to translate such knowledge into right action. When God recedes from view, when he stops speaking, and I'm jolted back to the humdrum of everyday life, it's tough. It's tough to live out a faithful response to God's promise. Anyway, it occurred to me that to get my family out of there was another trick I needed to pull off. I still had to convince Rachel and Leah to leave with me. That's the whole next section, verses 4 all the way to 16. Just in short, I asked them to come out to the fields with me and the flocks to have a private conversation far away from Laban. I could have just told them that God told me to leave, so let's go. But I had to be 100% sure that I could convince them. I just didn't have it in me to stay one more day in Haran. So what I said was, the reason I got so rich so fast was that, verse 5, the God of my father has been with me. And in verse 7, that it was God who hadn't allowed Laban to harm me. I even told them that an angel of God revealed to me in a dream the original idea for my breeding scheme. Now I know, once again, I'm bringing up God a lot. And to say God was behind my breeding scheme to outdo Laban, well, it's a bit of a stretch. But of course, God's behind everything, right? Well, what happens is that my wives say that they were already convinced of how horribly their father had treated them, and they were just thrilled to get out of here. Why did I ever spend all that time, effort, trying to convince them? Using a lot of half-truths. It was a lot of work, worry, effort, all really for nothing. Anyway, without telling Laban, we all got up and left for Canaan. Verse 17, I put my children and my wives on camels, and I drove all my livestock ahead of me, along with all the goods I had accumulated. So finally, it'd been 20 long years. I was carrying all my newfound wealth with my wives and kids, riding on camels. Did you know that only the wealthiest people own camels? I mean, how many people do you know that own even one camel? So we're riding away like royalty here. I was feeling quite happy with myself. A large family, great wealth, and freedom. My scheme worked. Or did it? Little did I know that the seeds were being planted for the worst crisis of my life yet. Verse 19, can you believe it? When Laban wasn't looking, Rachel stole his household gods. And not only that, in the next verse, this same stealing language is turned against me. Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean by not telling him he was running away. Deceived Laban is more literally stole the heart of Laban. The repetition is not just a little hint. It's a hard blow. It says, I stole too. So there's no way around it. I too am a thief. Keeping Laban in the dark about this leaving, it wasn't the right thing to do. But it did seem risky to leave it to chance that our departure plans would just fall into place. It just seemed too risky to leave it to leave it to God, I guess. As it turned out, excuse me. As it turned out, my not telling Laban was the greater risk. My deceiving him, stealing his heart, that was the real problem. Now, Laban and his whole posse of relatives began chasing us down. It almost resulted in the undoing of everything, of both my newfound family and property. Could have really been bad. As Laban said to me in verse 29, I have the power to harm you. And then I made it even worse. In verse 32, I told Laban he could kill whoever stole his household gods. Who would have thought it'd be Rachel? But really, he could have killed us all. When I first came here, I was running for my life. Now in leaving, I was running for my life again. I sowed deception of my brother in Canaan, and I had reaped deception of my uncle here in Haran. The poetic justice of it all made it obvious that God himself was disciplining me. But I refused to learn. I had made my own bed, and I was laying. You know what I mean. Your English language is so confusing. For far too long, I've been trying to improve my life, but I was actually only making it worse. If I could go back to the middle of my struggle and the middle of feeling stuck, and there's no way out, well, what could I have done better? Well, for one, I could have started being thankful for what I did have. I had God's amazing promise to be with me and bless me. And I had his promise to funnel his promises to Abraham through me. God's plan to restore the world is funneled through me. Second, not only do I have such promises to be thankful for, I've got the evidence of God keeping these promises to me already. I mean, year after year, he's been blessing me. Just look at all these kids he's given me. He's been providing for me in the past. It only makes sense that I trust him to provide for my future. What I said in verse 5 was exactly right. Now, I said it with, admittedly, some mixed motives, but it was spot on. The God of my father has been with me. And in verse 7, God has not allowed Laban to harm me. Even Laban said, God blessed him through me. God is blessing others through me. The promise to Grandpa Abraham is flowing through me. So having God's promises to me and all the evidence that he's been already keeping these promises, I should have just trusted him. I should have just waited on him to take care of me. There's a rumor going around here that in previous weeks, you've talked about one of my prime motivations being FOMO. And yes, it's true. I had the fear of missing out on what I want when I want it. What's more, while we're talking in acronyms, it's my FOMO that drives my MO, DIY. It drives my modus operandi. Do it yourself. And it was because of my MO, DIY, rather than asking for God's help and doing things God's way, that I ever got stuck in the first place. I kept thinking more of my MO, DIY would make my life better. Actually just made it worse and worse. Rachel stole. I stole. We deceived. We took advantage of others, especially when they weren't looking. I fled to Haran in the first place because I stole what wasn't rightfully mine when Dad couldn't see. I talked with my wives out in the field where Laban couldn't see. And now I've absconded with my family precisely when Laban couldn't see. It's my fault that I'm fleeing once again. Why wouldn't Laban and his enforcement gang of cousins march out after us, maybe even to kill us, just like Esau aimed to do? My MODIY was a dead end. In more ways than one, you might say. There's a proverb that says, the one who digs a pit will fall into it. As you know, my name means heel grabber or master manipulator. Do you remember what Esau said about it? He said, I'm rightly called Jacob. You could also say that as a master manipulator, I'm also a master pit digger. But if we're all being honest, couldn't we all rightly be called Jacob? All of us are master manipulators, aren't we? And so also, all of us are master pit diggers as well. With our MODIY, we all grasp for what we think is good for ourselves, though it's really to our harm. Why do we do it? I think it's to keep from going to God in prayer, to keep from having to wait on Him, on His perfect timing, and on His perfect way. Yet in spite of all this, can you believe it? With Laban on the march, just as the heat couldn't get any hotter, God showed up again for me. But this time it was to Laban. And he said to Laban, verse 24, be careful not to say a thing to Jacob, either good or bad. Meaning, I think, as some of your looser translations will say, leave him alone. Yet, having just literally said to Laban, don't say a thing, well, Laban proceeds to launch off into a very wordy speech. Verses 26, 27, 28, 29. We don't even have time to read it. They tell me you guys get 3 meals a day here, so we need to go to lunch. But anyway, after some back and forth between us, Laban threatens me, accuses me of deceiving him. He starts hunting for those idols, those stolen idols. This is the part of the story everyone remembers, so we've got to get to this. Verse 33, so Laban went into my tent, the one he suspects most, and into Leah's tent, and into the tent of the 2 female servants, Bilhah's tent, Zilpah's tent. He found nothing. But after he came out of Leah's tent, he entered Rachel's tent, the least suspected of all. But my dear little sneaky Rachel. Now Rachel had taken those household gods and put them inside her camel's saddle and was sitting on them. Laban searched through everything in the tent, but found nothing. Rachel said to her father, don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period. So he searched, but could not find the household gods. Can you believe it? Rachel hid them in her saddlebag where she's sitting with her dress covering over them. She tells her dad she can't get up. Literally, it's because of her womanly way. Now, I'm not going to pretend to explain it, whether she was or wasn't, but she sure outfoxed him a good one. And so much for Laban's gods. It looks here like they're trapped in a state of ritual impurity. What a joke. Gods? They don't deserve to be called anything similar to the one true God. Speaking of the one true God, why exactly did Rachel steal those gods? I don't really know. But obviously, I'm not the only one in my family struggling to trust God alone to take care of my problems. I stole. Rachel stole. We're guilty. This kind of deceiving and manipulating, it's a blatant refusal to trust God with our lives. And while I'm admitting my faults, as much as I love so many people think this story is about me, it's really a story about God. It's about what God does despite us. He shows up. He intervenes for his own to carry out his promised blessing for us, despite us. He obviously intervenes to warn Laban not to harm me. But he also intervenes, even though it's not explicitly said, by keeping Laban from finding those stolen idols. Who knows what would have happened if he had? God really was with me this whole time. It's exactly as I said to Laban in verse 42. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac, had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you. God has indeed been with me. I like to think the truth of these words hit home for Laban, so he immediately asked for a truce, a covenant between us. So we build stone monuments. As he said in verse 52, here is this heap and here is this pillar I have set between you and me. This heap is a witness. This pillar is a witness that I will not go past this heap to your side to harm you, and you will not go past this heap and pillar to my side to harm me. It's a happy ending, I guess. But that doesn't make it right what Rachel did or what I did. Just like when God blessed me in my breeding scheme, it doesn't make that right either. But as my story says right at its very end in chapter 50, God is always taking our bad intentions and using them for his good purpose. What an amazing God we have. The lesson is certainly not that more MODIY is fine, to go on sinning that grace might abound. In fact, the fallout from my lack of trust is huge. Those stone monuments, as much as they might mark a happy ending of sorts, at the same time, they're a lasting testament to a very sad ending. From here on, you see, there's a permanent lack of trust between me and my uncle. We've essentially made a non-aggression pact. That we need one is my fault. And so our families will remain bitter enemies for centuries because of my actions. I hope you can learn a bit from my story, especially when life's got you down, you're feeling stuck, or you're feeling like you're failing to reach that place in life you'd hoped you'd reach. I too often have had to learn the hard way. Don't be like me. Avoid your MODIY. You might think it'll make your life better, but it's only gonna make it worse. Let me just leave you with 3 suggestions on doing it differently. 1, pray and wait on God's timing. The better path is to seek him. He's got a track record of coming through for his people. 2, turn to God in thanks. Thank him for what you do have. Thank him for your everyday blessings that are so easy to overlook. And for the future blessings that he's promised to bring about through you. And finally, turn to God in praise. Praise him that he's a God who shows up, who intervenes for us despite us. He takes our manipulative MODIY acts and turns them into opportunities to spread his goodness and his blessing. As they say, God uses crooked sticks to draw straight lines. God uses crooked Jacobs to draw straight lines. My story suggests all of us are Jacobs.